Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's Dark Reading webinar, Deception, the Next Step in Cyber Defense, sponsored by Illusive and broadcast by Informa. I'm Sarah Peters with Dark Reading, and I'll be your moderator today. We have just a few announcements before we begin. This webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speakers, download resources, share this webinar via social media outlets, and participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. You may also download a copy of the slides via the resources widget. Toward the end of our webinar, we'll ask you to complete our survey found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a minute to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information on how we can improve future events. And lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen or type your issue into the Q&A area, and we'll be glad to offer one-on-one assistance. And now on to the presentation, Deception, the Next Step in Cyber Defense. Discussing today's topic are Dan Norman and Wade Lance. Dan Norman is a Senior Solutions Analyst at the ISF, helping ISF members to manage current and emerging information and cyber risks. Dan's historical focus has been on threat intelligence and technology forecasting, with emphasis on running cybersecurity exercises to prepare organizations for future threats. Dan is also the lead author of the Human-Centered Security Research Series, which leverages psychological theory to understand manipulative attack techniques and identifies how weaknesses in the human mind can lead to security incidents. Intriguing stuff. And Wade Lance is Field CTO at Illusive Networks. Wade has been productizing new technologies in education, healthcare, and information security for over 20 years. He has diverse experience in solution design for Global 1000 cybersecurity teams, an extensive background in advanced cyber attack detection, and a specialty in cyber deception methods and platforms. Prior to his career in information technology, Lance was a professional mountain guide, and as program director at Appalachian Mountaineering, we're going to ask him exactly how he pronounces that, he developed a new method for technical rock and ice climbing instruction that is still used today to teach advanced skills for the most dangerous environments. So you can direct your ice climbing safety questions to Wade at the end of our program, but first, these gentlemen are going to take us through some of our theory, strategy, and techniques related to threat deception. And we did start a little bit behind schedule because we had some technical difficulties. So I am going to now pass it on over to Dan. Dan's going to kick it off. So Dan, over to you.
Thank you very much, and apologies. That was actually my fault. I apologize.
It wasn't your fault. It was definitely our system's fault. So don't blame Dan, anybody.
Okay. Well, I'll crack into it. So thank you for having me. Over the last 30 years or so, organizations have historically focused their attention on significantly towards prevention, the prevention aspect of security. And I'm talking about firewalls, antivirus patching. There's been significant investment in threat intelligence feeds, SOCs, but organizations are still compromised. Deception technologies have been on security functions' radar for a few years now and have been greeted with mixed opinions. And one of the security commentators that we follow at the ISF, Brian Krebs, said that deception technologies are nice, but advisable only if your organization is already doing 99% of the rest of the basic security stuff. However, is he wrong? How do organizations find out that they've been compromised historically? Well, typically it comes from an external party. We're talking about monitoring services, researchers, emergency responses. In fact, 60% of all data breaches related to information comes from external sources, and that's a terrifying statistic. This still goes to show that if you implement 99% of protection methodologies currently on the market, you can still get breached. Can deception technologies and strategies give organizations an added edge over the market? Can threat intelligence be amplified or enhanced by deception technology? In my short presentation today, I'm going to try and take you through why deception technologies may potentially be the answer. A little bit of information about the ISF. So we at the Information Security Forum, we're essentially an association of over 400 organizations around the world. And we bring these organizations together to create good practice in terms of information risk management and information security. And we do that by collaborating with the members and creating research, which then feeds into our risk management and information security tools. We are completely independent and not-for-profit, so everything we do is about improving risk management, improving security of our members. These are the three elements of our security model. So we have our research and reports, and that could be on anything from cloud security to risk management, threat forecasting, through to our tools and methodologies, which are benchmarking, risk assessments, and other risk management tools, and then the knowledge exchange, so providing our members with a platform to network and discuss confidentially their information security strategy. My name's Dan Norman. I had a brief introduction there by Sarah, but basically I'm a senior solutions analyst at the ISF. I've been with the team for over 3 years now, and my real focus is on the threat intelligence piece, the threat forecasting piece, but through the lens typically of psychology. And what we've seen is that many organizations and many individuals that operate in the space of information security, they're comfortable with technology and less comfortable with psychology. But what we've seen over the last few years, and forever really, is that psychology plays such an important role in how we interact with one another and how attackers especially use techniques to exploit and manipulate. So my agenda, I've got a short presentation today, but I thought I'd conceptualize some of the ideas that we're talking about here by taking you through deception in terms of history. So looking at how the military and other types of professions have used deception for their own gain. And then that should create quite a nice segue into deception and how it's used in cybersecurity. Then my bulk of this presentation is going to be spent on how we at the ISF recommend you operationalize deception as part of security strategy. I'm not going to be going into the exact technical weeds. I believe the guys at Illusive will be taking you through that in their time later on, but I'll be focusing far more on whether or not deception technologies could be right for you as an organization and how you can use it in terms of defense. So as I said, I just want to conceptualize what we mean by deception, and I think that's best done by looking through history. So I've got a couple of short stories here, but to start with, here's a number of quotes, 3 quotes really, all about 100 years, 200 years between each other. So it just goes to show that deception hasn't really changed. The way we deliver deception has. The information age and digitization provides individuals, organizations with the opportunity to deceive attackers and for attackers to deceive organizations, but simply in the digital domain. The techniques haven't changed throughout the years. The first example here for the US contingent on the line today is the example of the reclamation of the Indianola. So what this was the most successful hoax of the US Civil War, and it's a perfect example of how the US Navy at the time deceived the Confederate Navy. So essentially, after losing one of its most prized ships called the USS Indianola, the opposing Navy, the Union Navy, attempted to recover the ironclad, intent on taking the Confederates. What they did was they built an old boat in about 12 hours using pork barrels on top of each other for smokestacks and 2 old canoes for quarter boats. And they said that her furnaces were built of mud and only intended to make black smoke and not steam. And painted on the side of the boat was the taunting slogan, "Deluded rebels cave in." To ensure that the Confederates saw the vessel approaching, the Navy launched it in broad daylight towards Confederate defenses. And what happened was the USS Indianola was essentially parked up on the side of the Mississippi. And when the Confederate Army and Navy saw the boat floating towards them, they decided to blow its magazines and scuttle the ship so it couldn't be used for either side. And what this goes to show is that you can create and deceive organizations, deceive armies into doing something they otherwise weren't, heightening confusion and creating chaos. The second example here that's probably best known and I've seen a few security commentators talk about this as well, is in World War II, the Operation Fortitude. Now, during the end of the World War II, the Germans knew that at some stage the Allies would launch a cross-channel invasion, but they were unsure of exactly where or when it would take place. And a crucial part of this preparation for D-Day, the Allies developed a deception plan and strategy to draw attention away from Normandy. D-Day deception plan was codenamed Operation Fortitude and was part of a larger overall deception strategy called Operation Bodyguard. Fortitude consisted of two parts. Fortitude North was meant to fool the Germans into thinking that the Allies would launch an attack on Norway, and Fortitude South, which was designed to convince the Germans that an invasion would occur northeast of Normandy in the Pas de Calais in France. And what happened was the Allies created a fictitious army known as the first US Army Group. And what they did, they created inflatable dummy tanks, dummy landing crafts. They sent out fake radio traffic to the Germans, and they even parachuted dummies across enemy territory and had double agents planted within the German territory that were delivering false information, creating an entirely deliberate plan to deceive what was going on. And what happened was Hitler happened to delay his Panzer tanks. It created so much chaos in the enemy territory, and D-Day was a massive success. But not a lot of individuals know this. But this is essentially deception. So there's a lot of common attributes of effective deception that we can take from the military, we can take from history, and apply to cybersecurity. What typically happens is on the attacker side and the defender side, there's psychological considerations. Power and security over a situation are arguably two of the most important social sensations at an individual and a group level. And what deception does is it takes this power away and this security away. Confusion can disrupt an attacker and brings that power back into the hands of the other party. Attackers have had the upper hand for far too long in cybersecurity. They cause disruption to our services. So why don't we disrupt them? Why don't we take the power out of their hands and put it back in our hands, putting us in the driving seat? And the third point on the right-hand side there, equalizing the odds, that's a key point for me, and something I always tell our ISF members, is that we expect attackers to attack. Why don't we do anything to manipulate them in real time? We can prevent attacks, but it's clearly not working, so something needs to be done. How does this translate into cybersecurity? Well, first point here, the aim of deception is to prevent a cybercriminal that has managed to infiltrate a network from doing any prolonged significant damage. And I think this boils down to three key points. We want to prevent an attacker from dwelling on our network for far too long. We want them to not be able to hide on our network. And we do not want them to achieve their mission success. Now, a key point here is the dwell, and attacks are often measured in dwell time or mean time to detect, at MTTR, an acronym that's typically used in the media. And statistics show that attackers are dwelling for weeks and even months on networks. But often attacks are at the most vulnerable when they just get into your network or system. Now imagine if your organization had a tripwire to tell your defense team the exact time an attack was taking place. Wouldn't that be great? Well, what is deception technology? Well, historically, deception tech has grown off the back of intrusion detection systems, firewalls, detection scanning. These things worked over time, and security industry and security professionals picked them up. Deception technology is likely the next step or the next logical evolution in this space. So typically, individuals think of honeypots when speaking about deception, but it can be literally anything that lures a hacker in or triggers some form of landmine or a trap. It can be placed in a server, a system, a computer, a file. It's essentially deployed to confuse an attacker. It helps gather attack information or helps alert the organization with real-time threat intelligence that an attack is in progress or an attacker has made their way onto the network. Now this all happens in real time. Building a repository of information on attacker behavior, techniques, methods used, any information about security weak points is flagged, and it may also provide information on countries where attacks came from, passwords that are typically compromised, or maybe where to baseline security controls to make the whole estate less vulnerable to attacks in the future. Now there are differing degrees of accessibility when it comes to deception technology. There's low involvement or high involvement deception. For example, an organization may keep a few portals open on their network and allow attackers to break into a certain area with limited access, or there may be a traditional honeypot which would have low involvement in a production environment, for example, on a corporate network, which can be in isolation or in a cluster, which informs incident response of types of attacks in real time. It helps incident response and threat intelligence to prepare for the future. There are a number of benefits to deception in cybersecurity. Now, while the threat to corporate networks and data is a daily growing concern, security teams rarely get an increase in budget to handle these new threats. For this reason, deception technology can be a very welcome solution. Automated alerts eliminate the need for manual effort and intervention, while the design of the technology allows it to be scaled easily as the organization and threat level grows. So with deception technologies and strategies, you can monitor and record attacker behavior, secure in the knowledge that they can do no more damage on your decoy system. The information you record about attacker behavior and techniques can be used to further secure your network from attacks in the future. Now, I just want to bring up a point here about threat intelligence, and I believe threat intelligence is an overused term. But what deception technology does is provide you with real, actionable threat intelligence in real time about attacker patterns, what they're after, and what they value in your estate. And I can use an example here from one of the members that I've spoken to in the manufacturing industry, and they thought that their IP was their crown jewel. So they set up their defensive infrastructure to mitigate threats against this. They also happened to set up a deception strategy, honeypots and virtual landmines around systems that house customer data. And what happened is it turned out that the attackers were after that information instead. They never would have known this without the deception technology in place, and were then able to change their security strategy over time to mitigate that emerging risk. The next point here is about dead ends, false positives, and alert fatigue, which can all hamper security efforts and put a massive drain on resources. Security operations centers, NOCs, and other types of security teams are currently seeing incident response and management of these threats as a big data problem. However, too much noise can result in IT teams becoming complacent and ignoring what could potentially be a legitimate threat. Deception technology reduces the noise with fewer false positives and high fidelity, packed full of useful data. And the CEO of Smokescreen, I was at a conference a couple of years ago, and he said that deception technologies moves away from searching for a needle in a haystack to searching for needles in a haystack of needles. And I thought that was quite a nice poignant point. Now, with deception technologies, we can gather hash values, IP addresses, domain names. However, what is better and more informative? The most informative data and information we can gather is the techniques, tactics, and procedures that the attacker is using, the tools at their disposal, the intent of the attacker, their psyche, how they're planning this, and their overall strategy. And what we've seen with organizations that have done this well is they see the attacker strategies unravel in front of their very eyes, and it sends the attacker immediately back to the drawing board. So who does this? Well, in my opinion, the organizations that I've seen do this well, and those that fund this well, are typically in finance, high tech, government, who want to take a degree of proactivity in their security. And I would argue, who in their right minds nowadays would just sit back and wait for an attack to take place? So moving on, there are some challenges to deception in cybersecurity. It isn't necessarily hard to implement. Any organization can place a lure, a token, or a honeypot in a production environment, in the DMZ, an endpoint, a server, or spoof details onto a public website for hackers to pick up. But making this look realistic with almost real data takes a degree of effort to do well. Conversations I've had with some of our members have gone two ways. There's a degree of risk when doing deception, and I personally have seen organizations do this very badly, and some do it very, very well. For example, a compromised honeypot can maybe attack other internal systems if misconfigured. We've seen poorly designed firewalls allowing traffic into non-deception areas, all adding stress to a security team, not reducing it. And it might not be right for everyone. I mean, every organization has a differing degree of maturity in terms of their security strategy. They have different controls, systems, technologies, preventative and detective controls in place. But who can honestly say that they're 100% secure? Some organizations that we've spoken to say that they're 95% secure, and every CISO or security team that I personally have spoken to knows exactly how to break into their own networks and systems. So why not lay a landmine or a trigger at the exact access point you know how to get into? Give your team the upper hand in the fight against attackers. So operationalizing deception as part of security strategy, a really important point that I and we at the ISF like to talk about. How does it really fit into the wider security strategy? Well, we know that there's gaps in defenses, the intrusion detection system, the incident event management system, the SOC isn't going to pick up everything. How does deception fit into that strategy? Well, let's consider first. For example, where would you in your organization rank your strategy in terms of your ability to detect and reflect or defeat threats? And the way we like to talk about this is using a mental deception model. There are many elements of the business that will need to be engaged to do deception well. So when you're doing this mental deception model, you need to involve business unit owners, security architects, developers, the SOC, security teams, red teams, pen testers. And it's really, really important to categorize your crown jewels. How an attacker might get there with the red team. How can we add tripwires or landmines to mitigate this risk? These are really important strategic discussions that need to be had from the outset before developing deception strategies. So moving on here, so before choosing whether or not deception technologies are right for you, the important factor is to understand the mission critical assets. Then assess the main adversarial threats, what has happened historically and how would attackers attack your business. Step C on the diagram on the left is where assessing whether deception or other strategies are right for you. How might deception counter the main adversarial threats? Well, this is where the information lifecycle comes in on the right-hand side of your screen. And many organizations take a network-centric view of how threat actors may get in. And this isn't necessarily wrong. However, we can argue it's relatively easy to understand how to get into a network or onto a server or how to access a file. But what about considering each step of the information lifecycle along this strategy? An attacker will likely target information of all forms along each step of this lifecycle, from creation all the way to destruction. Now, where would deception fit into this? Where could we throw an attacker off guard? Where can we monitor their behavior in real time? Now, for this table on screen, I won't go through every single point on here, but what we like to do at the ISF and what I like to say to our members is we want to understand what an attacker is, what the attacker does, their movements, their psyche, and I'd like to briefly try and get into the mindset of the attacker whilst using the adversarial attack chain. Now, if we start in reconnaissance, we know that an attacker can build a profile of an organization, they can go on the dark web, use publicly available information, establish their foothold. This may take days, weeks, or months, and we as an organization don't have the luxury of letting an attacker dwell for that amount of time. So what can we do? So for one example that I've seen some of our members do is during the reconnaissance phase, they've put AWS tokens up on GitHub or another publicly accessible location, and an attacker can try and access this key to an AWS bucket. What this does, if they've programmed this properly, is that it pings the alert and tells your organization IP addresses where they're coming from, and that gives you a leg up. And what they did is they passed that information on to the authorities, and the party was arrested before they could actually do any real damage to them. So moving on. So remember I mentioned the mental deception model, and this is how I recommend organizations to mentally map out potential attacks using our ISF threat event scenario planner, which uses the concept of the adversarial attack chain here. And it helps you map out typical attacker pathways. This essentially is a risk-based approach, assessing whether deception is right for your organization and where it can potentially fit. But what happens here, and this is an example that a real organization has used, is that they had network threat analytics off the back of a red team exercise. And here's what we found. We found that the attacker might get in through scanning the accessible networks. They made their way in by actually compromising a third party, someone in their supply chain, and were able to introduce code into one of their applications. So where could we put a tripwire or a landmine? Where is the most likely area of being attacked? We discussed putting a honeypot into every endpoint, but that was just a bit unrealistic. So we decided that we might put some sort of deception technology around one of their key applications. or build a fictitious application with the similar content and data as our real life application and sync that up to our incident event management logs, and the SOC can pick that up. So deception overall, how to improve the maturity of an organization? Well, deception is a capability in the defense team, and importantly, it is a strategy that can be built alongside other preventative and protective controls. It should complement your current strategy. We would need to know essentially what security measures are working and which are not. Where can deception complement the current strategy? And that's why I've got the point here about frequent communication with pen testers and red teamers, knowing how attackers work, getting into the mind of the attacker and mapping it out that way. It's not a quick fix, it is a strategy. There's a reason why in military history deception is referred to as a strategic move. There are a lot of really intelligent vendors working in this space that can help you assess your gaps in your current defenses. So do work with them if you can't do this on your own. There is a lot of publicly available information out there when it comes to data breaches. So look at your sector cousins, the other industries that are very similar to yours, and map out how attackers attack them. If you have similar infrastructure, what can we put in place to mitigate those risks? There's forums like ours and sector groups, and understand successful attack techniques as well as the deception strategies. We at the ISF provide organizations with an opportunity to have those confidential discussions. We're all in this together. It's us essentially versus them. And the next point here is start small. There's no harm in creating some sort of small deflection or detection strategy on one application, on one server, and then moving that across the entire estate if it works. And one point here that I'd like to bring up is that gathering data and gathering information about attackers is good, but what are you really doing with it? It reminds me of that scene in Indiana Jones when he swaps out the golden idol for a bag of sand, and we all know what happens after that. But I mean, arrogance can work in both ways. The attacker can be arrogant, but so can the organization. So really have a strategic think about why you want to deceive an attacker and what you're going to do with the information that you gather on them. And just to wrap up, is deception right for us? Well, it can be, and it should be. It should be integrated as part of a robust defense strategy. But there is a lot you need to consider before doing it. There's a lot of discussions that need to be had with relevant parties within the organization that can set you up to make the most out of deception in congruence and complementing other technologies and other strategies you are taking. The goal, as I was mentioning with the crown jewels piece, is you must always aim to protect your critical information assets. And what we recommend is that risk-based approach, knowing what the attackers are attacking, how they're getting in, and how we can prevent them. And then building that repository of information to understand attacker behavior. And over time, we can win the battle. Communication, collaboration, and ongoing assessments of that deception strategy are key. And that is my short presentation for today. So that, I think, was just on time for 30 minutes. So I'm going to pass on back to Sarah, I believe, or over to Wade.
Hey, thanks, Daniel. That was great. That was a great session. Appreciate the opportunity to share with the community today. So, again, my name is Wade Lance. I'm the field CTO at Illusive Networks. I've been in this space actually for over 11 years now with various organizations. And I want to talk about kind of operationalizing deception and why it is that things have really changed in the space pretty dramatically in the last 20 years, but in the last 5 or 6 years in particular. So let's dive right in. When we take a step back and think about deception as an overall capability, we think about what security teams, the pain and the difficulties that security teams are trying to operate under. And I think that at Illusive, we like to think of our goals as security organizations. And so for us, the target is a 0-0-0 world. And we think about that in these terms. What if there were no privileged accounts that were accessible to an attacker, right? Once someone established a beachhead, what if privileged accounts were not available to them? What if there were no false positives that were distracting defenders away from critical information about what's really important? And I love the example of, you know, trying to find the poison needle in the needle stack, right? Because there's a lot of difficulty out there and alerts that are important, but the question is, which ones are the real threats? And again, crown jewel focus, that's a critical element. And then last would be, what if there was no wasted investigation time to slow responders as they try to engage on those most important events? And so, you know, we're never going to get to a 0-0-0 world, but it is an aspiration, you know, for at Illusive. This is what we're focusing on. How do we overcome these problems for our customers and for security teams? And so our approach is this. The first thing that we do is to shrink the attack surface. When we think about how attackers operate in the space, when we think about what does an attacker do once they've established a beachhead? Okay, I've got a beachhead, now what? What we find over and over and over again is that attackers are able to leverage the kind of credential and connection information that they find resident in our networks. And this is a giant problem. If there are easy ways to move laterally within the space, then we're going to have problems. And so shrinking the true attack surface, simply denying the attacker this easy movement, becomes a critical component in a security strategy. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. The second piece of what we do at Illusive is to expand the attack surface, to create an illusion, and this is where the deception comes in, to create an illusion to an attacker that has established a beachhead that the environment is simply larger than it actually is. There are more servers, more applications, more users with more interactions. And the idea here is to use automation to create pain for the attacker. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And the last thing is that to collect forensics from source systems when we get a detection event, either based on deception or not, but to accelerate the rate at which we're able to collect real-time information from the source systems when we do get a detection, so that the SOC team has the kind of information that they need to respond appropriately. And again, we're back to the crown jewel discussion, right? How do we appropriately triage a detection event based on the critical nature of that event, not just where the beachhead is, but where the crown jewels are relative to that. And of course, at Illusive, we do that all without agents, and so that'll be a critical part of what we do going forward. So let's take a hard look at, you know, lateral movement. What happens when an attacker gets a beachhead, wherever that is? And I love this example, right, in the picture here, because somebody decided that it was critical to provide a security control into this parking lot, and you can see the little gate there. They got the little lift arm, the security, and you know, you go up to the device there, and you know, scan your card, and it opens the gate and lets you in. At some point, after a little bit of snow, you know, from the top of the building, they looked at and actually audited the effectiveness of the control, right? And what it reveals is that, you know, your control is one thing, but without an effective audit of is that control operating, how well is it actually working, people find ways around controls, right? And so when we move this over to a security paradigm, we realize that credentials and connection strings, the data about how systems interact, that's left over in the environment, becomes the residue that attackers use to move laterally through our networks. And so being able to have visibility into this information becomes a critical element in what we do as security organizations. So this lack of visibility becomes a giant problem for most security teams. We find that the connectivity between systems is volatile. The normal business activity that we have inside of our networks orphans credentials and connection data and leaves behind pathways, and much of this is invisible to the security team. You know, defenders think in terms of what you can't do in the network. What controls do we have in place? but the attacker only thinks in terms of what I can do. If I get a hold of somebody's computer and I simply leverage the credential and connection history on that system to go where that system goes at the same time of day that that system goes using the same credentials, it becomes very easy to move through that environment. And so at Illusive, this is where we've addressed this issue with a broad set of capabilities. And the first is around reducing this true attack surface. And you're going to see how this plays into deceptive storytelling, because if there are just too many easy ways to move between the systems and the environment, deception will be much less effective. And so if we zoom in here on this picture, the little boxes, right, the little greenish boxes represent individual hosts, servers and workstations in the environment. The little people icons there represent credentials that live on those systems. And then the little crowns represent connection strings to crown jewels, right? Could be browser history, could be application history, could be information in memory, wherever it is. And so what an Illusive Attack Surface Manager does is it examines this data endpoint by endpoint, and it highlights resident data on production systems that will easily allow an attacker to move against sensitive systems or to get access to privileged credentials. And this kind of information is critical to understanding how movement could happen. And we've done assessments on over 500,000 endpoints in various organizations. And what is astounding to us is that we see that nearly 1 in 5 systems have some form of a privileged credential or credential residue or access token existent on them at some point in the month, right, that could easily be leveraged in that environment. So what Attack Surface Manager does is continuously examines the environment, looks at these systems, and then actually mitigates these issues, right? Cleans and removes this information, simply denying the attacker the easy movement between systems. So this kind of basic cyber hygiene is really a must for any organization of any size, because we're trying to deal with what an attacker can do once they're inside our environment, and if we make it easy for them, the fight is lost before it really gets going. So the next stage in the process, because you may ask, hey Wade, what does this have to do with deception, is exactly this. At Illusive, we use the information that we collected when we examine the systems to understand how systems interact in this environment. How do they interact with data center systems? How do hosts interact with each other? How do they interact with cloud assets? What are the movements and flows? And then what the Illusive system does, and again, we're back here, all the little green systems represent computers and hosts in the environment. What the Illusive system does is it tells a story on every single production system. Once we've removed privileged credentials, sensitive connection strings that could be a risk to the organization, we then backplant a deceptive story that is customized for every single system, so that when an attacker gets access to a system and attempts to move to other systems related to that host, they are confronted with a data problem, right? Where the majority of the stories and histories being told on the production systems are in fact deceptive. And this totally changes the game because, look, attackers have been using automated processes to create manual work for us as the security teams. But now with Illusive-based deception, we're using an automated process to create manual work for the attackers. When they land in the system and they try to learn about the environment, the majority of the information that they're gathering from that environment is false. And when they attempt to move in that space, if they leverage any of the deceptive data, and they consistently do, we immediately get a detection event on that interaction that points us exactly at the host that the attacker has compromised. This is so effective that Illusive is undefeated in over 100 Tier 1 red team exercises against some of the best red teams on the planet, the NSA, Mandiant, Microsoft, and Cisco. One of the interesting things about this method is that the more mature and advanced the red team is, the more they fall into this trap with Illusive. Again, because the deception stories aren't being told out on honeypots and out on network-based systems. The deception stories are being told out on the production assets, and it totally changes the game of the effectiveness of early detection against compromised systems. Then the last phase is where once we do get a detection event on a system, Illusive uses an automated response capability to send a forensics binary to the source of the system and gather data directly from the compromised production system in real time. And this is so effective that it's dramatically changing the forensics and triage time. Many times by the time the SOC analyst can get a look at the very first alert, they've already got Illusive contextual data off of the source system, and it's dramatically changing the times of response based on moving not just the deception story, but then also the forensics investigation all directly to the source of the attack itself. And so one of the things I like about the Illusive deception method is that it's become extremely effective against insiders. The storytelling is so accurate, and it's maintained and automatically tuned over time to changes in the environment that at one retailer, we were, right after we were deployed, very quickly be able to catch a 22-month-long money laundering campaign that had been going on in that environment. Illusive provided a deceptive object with the attacker leverage because, you know, insiders and attackers are greedy. They tend to see what all they can get at, and we're going to use that against them. What was interesting is that when the SOC team reached out to them to try to understand what was happening, the user claimed it was malware operating on their system. However, our forensics, the instant forensics, demonstrated that the malware was installed on the system 15 minutes after the call from the SOC, right? And it turns out that both a user and a supervisor were implicated in this scheme. There's millions of dollars that were moved through third parties, and this had been a long-going campaign. And again, this is one of the changes in deception. In the past, it was very difficult to use deception against insiders or people that had solid knowledge of the environment, and you know, the Illusive method focusing on the production assets has totally turned that around. And so one of the last elements we've added to this are beaconized documents, where the addition of files that are beaconized, again, this is a great capability. Anybody that opens these files, the files phone home and notify the organization. And again, beaconized documents have been around for a long time in the deception space. What we found at Illusive is that targeted deployments of these, again, on production systems, in environments that, you know, honestly most users can't get out, has been extremely effective in showing us where insiders are gaining access to information that they would normally get access to. So one of the things that has been so exciting, just to look at some of the changes in triage time per incident where we're using the deception-triggered forensics, is this dramatic shift in the capabilities we're providing to Tier 1 and Tier 2 analysts. One organization, you can see that the Tier 2 analysts typically were spending about an hour per incident. We've reduced that down to about 10 minutes. I mean, this dramatically changes the capacities, and it just reduces the stress on the SOC team by having this real-time information pulled off of a system in a lightweight, efficient manner. We're pretty excited about this. It's totally changing the dynamic for incident investigation and response in our customers. So one particular bank, you know, before the Illusive platform, had a very manual process to either isolate computers, conduct incident analysis. They didn't have source-based forensics. And what Illusive has done, this organization, we've done a study now over the last, I think it's about a 90-day long analysis of their SOC operations. And with our agentless binary on-demand sent out to systems, we've reduced incident triage time from 6 hours on average down to, I think, about 10 minutes. And this is just a dramatic change in their processes. And again, because we have the clarity that is provided by a deceptive alert, and then this automated ability to gather information directly from the source, the production system where the attacker is operating, it allows organizations to move beyond, I would say, anomaly-based detection, where we're dealing with probabilities, to detection that is much more binary in nature. Look, someone violated security policy to get access to deceptive information, and then they used it in an attempt to move against neighboring systems. That's a very high fidelity alert, and something that obviously needs immediate attention. So one last thing to draw your attention, and then we'll open it up for some questions, is that the MITRE organization has been studying attacker methodologies and defensive structures for years and years. And one of the things that they've announced here just recently is the MITRE SHIELD framework. And SHIELD framework is the corollary to the MITRE attack framework, where MITRE attack framework looks at the attacker methodologies and says to the security teams, hey, do we have security that is positioned to address every phase of the attacker method after they've established a beachhead, MITRE attack? Well, MITRE SHIELD really turns that around and says, okay, on our defensive structures, are we moving beyond a passive, and I think Daniel brought this up a couple of times, are we moving beyond a passive defense and a reactive defense into an active defense that allows us to engage the attacker and reduce dwell time and effectiveness? And so this document, again, we can get you a copy of this after the session, is where we look at the MITRE SHIELD framework. Notice, and again, apologize, this slide is a little busy, but all of the elements here in either black or orange in every phase of MITRE SHIELD, this is an element that Illusive addresses with one of our capabilities, right? Whether it's the prevention and hygiene capability doing the cleanup, whether it's the deception and detection capability, or whether it's the response capability, everything in black and orange here is something that Illusive does provide a capability along the SHIELD structure. I will say that notice all of the orange elements in this structure require a deceptive method, right? It's simply not possible to address the capabilities required in the SHIELD structure, everything in orange, if you're not using a deceptive method. And so it's really become kind of a standard, for most organizations. This is the kind of thing that they can leverage to great success in MITRE SHIELD. So thank you very much. It's just been a pleasure to get to work with the folks at Dark Reading and Daniel and everyone. So feel free to reach out to us along the lines of any of these pieces. And thank you for your time, Sarah. I'm going to pass it back over to you. I think we've got some time for some questions.
Thank you so much, Wade. That was delightful. I just learned a lot. We do have some time for questions. Before we're going to do that, I'm going to ask you all to direct your attention to our webinar survey, available on the right of the presentation window. If you closed it, you can reopen the widget by clicking the icon along the bottom of your screen. Thanks in advance for doing that. Now, as a reminder to participate in Q&A, just type your question into the text box located to the right of the presentation window, or click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. If we're not able to answer all submitted questions during today's webinar, we'll be sure to share them with our speakers, who can reply to you offline. Okay, quick clarification question, and Dan Norman, I'm gonna direct this one to you first. There are some questions from the audience just about the legality of threat deceptions. Are there any legal ramifications? Are lawyers going to tell you, hey, this is entrapment? You've baited somebody by putting deception technology out there. Has anybody ever come to you at ISF with those kinds of concerns?
Well, to be honest, the concept of entrapment typically is a practice where law enforcement agents induce people to commit a crime, right? That's law enforcement. So it changes depending on where you are, what geography you're in terms of what data you can gather on different people. But in my opinion, and what I've seen, is that entrapment is very complicated, but typically entrapment is about law enforcement entrapping individuals or kind of baiting them into committing a crime. If you as an organization are using, it's not really baiting, is it? It's, say if you're using a piece of deception technology to mimic your infrastructure, and an individual, a hacker, comes onto your network and tries to exfiltrate that data, that is simply evidence that they have stolen that data. That's not entrapment. So I would, if you have had legal counsel, I would go back and ask to clarify that with them. But what we've seen is that it's not illegal to do this stuff. It's illegal to come onto someone's network uninvited to exfiltrate that data. So hopefully that clears that up a little bit.
Yeah, I would.
Thank you so
I would
much.
just make one additional.
Go ahead, Lee.
Yeah, I would just make just one additional comment, and that's that good use policies, acceptable use policies, are also a great layer of defense in this space. Right, make it clear in the organizational documents that employees sign. Say this is the acceptable use. You're not allowed to go looking for things just because the door is open. Doesn't mean you're allowed to go in there. And we've seen that kind of policy be used very effectively to make it clear that it's not an acceptable use to just go breaking into things because you found a way to get into it. Yeah.
Great. Now, Wade, I want to ask you a couple of related questions that are coming in through the audience. I guess how you want to make sure, obviously, that the attackers are going to fall for what you're putting out there, right? You want to make sure that whatever deceptions you have put out there are going to be tempting to them. But you've also got your red teams who might know that there is deception at work. So what do you, I guess, how does the whole fact that you're using deception change your experience with red teams? And also, are there any just general pitfalls that we need to avoid? If we find that our deception techniques are just not working, is there something that we should do to tweak them to make sure that that we are being convincing to the attackers? That's a long question, but am I hitting? Okay, go ahead.
Absolutely. No, it's a great question, and it represents some experience in the space, right? And people that deception has been around for a long time. And look, this is one of the big changes in the space, right? Is that there's a couple of answers to this question. One is automation. In order for deception to be effective, it has to be customized for every single system. This is why Illusive is so effective against red teams and against attackers, by the way, is that we do customized deception storytelling. We use automation to tell deceptive historical stories on every production system where that system is being used in a logical, meaningful way that makes sense for that particular system, right down to what browsers are in use and is this more of an administrative-based system or how is the system used? And so we can certainly follow up with people and talk about that automation. But if you don't automate deception and customize it to every single system, you're not going to tell compelling stories. The other thing that I've heard in the space, and this is a huge shift and why I was so impressed with Illusive and joined the organization, was that you'll hear people say all the time that in order for deception to be effective, the most important thing is deception believability or efficacy. All the deceptions have to be as believable as possible. And that's simply a misunderstanding. At Illusive, when we deploy deceptive data into the production environment, we use a gradient of believability. Some of the deceptive data that we plant is not very believable at all. If you're at all a sophisticated operator, you will see that information and realize, hey, this is deceptive information. Some of the information that we plant is moderately believable, and some of it is sophisticated enough that it looks more realistic than the actual production activity that's happening on the system. And why this is so effective is that we know how attackers operate. Illusive was not founded by cybersecurity people. It was founded by nation-state attackers, people who made their living working for their government, penetrating the networks of other people. And they knew this. When a sophisticated attacker, a red teamer, an insider identifies deception in play on the system that they're on, we know what they do. They slow down, right? If you move quickly on a system that's been modified with deception, you're going to be detected very quickly. It also removes all of the attacker's automation. Very few automated tools will be successful for the attacker if they use automation in an environment that's been manipulated with deception. And then what the low believability deceptive data does is it makes the high believability deception seem that much more believable. And so believing they have identified the deceptive information, they now leverage the high complexity deceptive data, and we catch them every time. This is effective so much so that both the Microsoft and Cisco red teams, where we performed these tests, we did it in their production environments. They had home field advantage, and we still detected them every time both of those organizations invested in Illusive after those exercises. So that kind of automation is what's been a real game changer in the deception space.
Good stuff. Since we started a little bit late, Dan, I'm just going to give you one chance to give us any final thoughts about anything, and then I will wrap us up for the day.
Well, I think it just goes to show, especially with Wade's presentation there, that I think deception can fit into anyone's security strategy. I think that there's many misconceptions about deception, and I just think going into this with an open mind, reading around the topic, going to these vendors and understanding their strategy and how it can potentially fit into yours, I think it can help mitigate a lot of risks and mitigate a lot of threats that come in as well. So it's just something that I think is going to boom over the next couple of years or so.
Sounds good. There's definitely there are a lot of complicated and also very simple things that you guys talked about today, and it's going to be really interesting to see how this space develops. I was trying to remember today when the first time I spoke to Illusive was, and it was longer ago than I realized. I'm excited to see how this is all going to keep growing and expanding over the next few years. In any case, that is all the time we have for questions today. That is all the time we have for this event today. So thank you so much, Dan, and thank you so much, Wade. We appreciate your time and your expertise. And of course, thank you to all of you in the audience. We would not do this without you. Within the next 24 hours, you're going to receive a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Feel free to invite your colleagues and peers who may not have been available to listen to the event today. This webinar is copyright 2020 by Informa. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted by Dark Reading and Illusive, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. Once again, I'm Sarah Peters. On behalf of our guests, Dan and Wade, our sponsor Illusive, and everyone at Dark Reading, I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. Please stay safe out there, and we'll see you next time.